She was just the nanny. Until the billionaire saw her shielding his blind daughter with her own body during a fire. He thought he hired help. But what he witnessed that night would expose a lie, unravel a legacy, and reveal the only woman who ever truly saw them both. Before we dive into this unforgettable journey, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? If stories about love, sacrifice, and second chances speak to your heart, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we're bringing you another powerful story you won't want to miss. The Vale estate stretched across acres of manicured land, its hedges cut to perfect symmetry, its fountains glistening under the morning sun. To the outside world, it was a palace of order and wealth, yet to Nicholas Vale, it had become a hollow monument, a place where silence echoed louder than laughter, and where the memory of his late wife lingered like a shadow in every corridor. From his office on the second floor, Nicholas stood before the towering windows, a steaming cup of black coffee forgotten in his hand. He was reviewing reports when movement below caught his eye. In the south garden, where the maze of hedges wound in elegant curves, his daughter Lila walked slowly, her small hands brushing against the greenery. Beside her was the new nanny, Grace Morale. Nicholas narrowed his eyes. She was young, not much older than 26, with dark hair tied neatly back and a posture that was both firm and gentle. She had been hired only a week earlier by his assistant, after the last nanny quit in frustration. 6 nannies in 8 months, none of them had lasted long. Lila's blindness, combined with her grief after her mother's death, had created storms few could weather. Nicholas had not expected Grace to be different. But as he watched, something unusual struck him. Grace wasn't tugging Lila along or speaking loudly as though volume could replace patience, like so many others had done. Instead, she moved at Lila's pace, guiding her hand to the hedge, describing its shape, its scent. Nicholas saw her crouch beside the girl, letting Lila's fingers trace the soft new leaves. "That one is fresh," Grace's lips seemed to form. "Can you smell the green?" Lila tilted her face toward the hedge, giggled, and nodded. That giggle pierced Nicholas' chest like a blade and a balm at once. It had been months since he'd heard it, not since before his wife's illness had stolen brightness from their lives. He gripped the coffee cup tighter, the warmth searing his hand, yet he barely noticed. The game continued. Grace led Lila deeper into the maze, asking her to guess directions. "Left or right? Trust your steps." Lila hesitated, then chose left. She bumped into a hedge, and instead of scolding, Grace laughed softly, steadying her. "Every explorer makes mistakes. That's how we learn." Nicholas's throat tightened. Explorer. No nanny had ever called his daughter that. They spoke of her as fragile, broken, incomplete. Yet this woman treated her like an adventurer charting undiscovered lands. The hours slipped by, but Nicholas didn't return to his paperwork. He watched. He watched as Lila smiled, as her small hands grasped Grace's with trust. He watched as Grace knelt to the child's level, never towering above her. He watched as something he thought gone forever stirred again in his daughter's face. Joy. Still, he was not ready to believe. That evening, when the garden was quiet, Nicholas sat at the long dining table across from Lila. She ate silently, carefully, her hands locating utensils with the practiced precision of someone used to navigating a sightless world. Nicholas attempted small talk, asking about her day. "It was fun," she said softly, a smile tugging at her lips. "Grace says I'm an explorer." Technically choked on his wine. The word sounded strange on Lila's tongue. Light, hopeful. He studied her face, noting the subtle lift in her expression. Perhaps it was coincidence. Perhaps the novelty of a new nanny would wear off as it always did. He convinced himself not to read too much into it. But deep inside, curiosity had already cracked the armor of his cynicism. That night, long after Lila had gone to bed, Nicholas returned to his office. The mansion was dark, the storm clouds outside gathering with the threat of rain. He poured himself another glass of whiskey, intending to bury himself in contracts, but his eyes drifted again to the security monitors. The feed from the West Wing flickered, showing the nanny's quarters and the hallway outside Lila's room. Nicholas wasn't sure why he tapped into it. Habit, perhaps, or the nagging thought of his daughter's newfound laughter. Hours passed in silence, until a flash of lightning lit the screens. Then it began. The storm broke with a roar, thunder rattling the windows. Moments later, the monitor showed Lila's door creaking open. The little girl stepped into the hall, her hands trembling, her face pale. Nicholas leaned forward, startled. He hadn't known storms frightened her. Before he could react, another figure appeared. Grace, rushing out of her room barefoot, her robe hastily tied. She knelt before Lila, pulling her into her arms as the thunder crashed again. The girl buried her face in Grace's shoulder, sobbing. Nicholas turned up the volume, his breath caught. Grace whispered, her voice steady, "You're safe. I'm here. Listen to my heart." Boom, boom, just like the thunder, but softer. "It can't hurt you." She rocked the child gently, humming a lullaby low and soothing. Lila's sobs subsided slowly, her breathing syncing with the rhythm of Grace's song. Nicholas's chest tightened painfully. Not even he had known. In all his calculated routines, in his fortress of wealth, he had missed the one truth that a stranger discovered within a week. His daughter feared the storms. The whiskey glass trembled in his grip. He set it down, staring at the screen as though Grace stayed with Lila until the storm faded. She didn't return to her room immediately, but lay beside the child, stroking her hair until sleep claimed her. Only then did she close the door softly behind her. Nicholas sat in silence, long after the feed went dark, his thoughts spiraling. Who was this woman? She had stepped into his world quietly, without demand, without pretense. Yet in a matter of days she had reached his daughter's heart in ways he, her own father, had not. For the first time in years, Nicholas Vale felt uncertain and, strangely, unmoored. By morning, the rain had rinsed the gardens clean, beating the hedges with silver and steeping the air in the scent of wet earth. Nicholas woke before his alarm, the storm's echo still vibrating along his nerves. He dressed without calling for help, left his untouched espresso on the tray and walked out to the south lawn as if gravity itself drew him. From the gravel path he studied the maze, its green corridors bright and slick with dew. He told himself to be rational. A competent nanny had soothed a frightened child, that was all. Yet, as he followed the trimmed edge with his fingertips, he felt the ache of a father who had confused order with care. He could purchase cameras, generators, private security, all the armor money could assemble, but he could not purchase what the screen had shown him. A heartbeat offered as shelter and a lullaby steady enough to outlast thunder. By the time the house stirred, he had retreated to his office and reopened the surveillance console, no longer to police but to learn. Lila's tutor arrived, and the hallway monitor flickered as Grace led the girl from her room. "Left hand on the rail, right hand counting steps," Grace said, and Lila echoed with growing pride. At the landing, Grace placed a small basket in Lila's hands. "Nicholas frowned at the Spaceoval's summer," she declared, leaves to her face. "And lemon is sunshine pretending to be fruit." Grace chuckled softly, letting the basket become a map, naming each scent until Lila repeated them like landmarks. She guided the girl to the window, opened it a fraction, and asked what the wind sounded like. Lila listened, counted birdsong, and whispered that the wind smelled like clean stone. He minimized the feed and began scrolling through earlier clips he had never bothered to watch. There was Grace 2 days before, kneeling by Lila's shoes, narrating loops and rabbit ears and the tug that makes a knot hold. There she was in the kitchen, tapping a wooden spoon on a pot's rim so the simmer could be heard. There again, along the east wing, pressing stickers low on the baseboard like a secret constellation. Every frame revealed intentions shaped like kindness. At lunch he joined them without announcement. Lila's posture straightened when his chair scraped the floor, a reflex of old politeness. Grace described the plate like a compass. Praised at 12, greens at 3, pears at 6, then stepped back as if the table belonged to father and daughter. Lila speared a noodle and grinned. "Explorer rations," she said. "What does an explorer study?" he asked. She chewed, then answered, "Everything that isn't afraid of me." The sentence tilted his world by a fraction he could feel in his bones. That afternoon, his sister called about a charity seating chart and paused mid-sentence. "You sound different," she said. "There was a storm," he replied, surprised by his own honesty. After the call, He watched from the window while Grace and Lila walked the outer path barefoot, each step deliberate. Grace was teaching the ground to speak. He thought of how many rooms he himself drifted through without truly touching anything. Later, he met with his head of security, who reported the usual metrics: perimeter tight, generators tested, new cameras calibrated. "And the staff?" Nicholas asked. "No breaches," the man said, then hesitated. "Morales improvised," Nicholas surprised himself. "Approve it." On the elevator ride up, he realized approval was not generosity. It was surrender to a better design. Dusk arrived as thin pewter light. The garden held its breath with them. In the music room, a metronome clicked like a small, patient heart. Grace clapped patterns, Lila echoed them with wooden claves. "That's 4, Lila announced. 4 is a square." "How does a square sound?" Grace asked. Lila tapped steady beats, then added a flourish at the end, and laughed at her own rebellion. He could not name what rose in him then, equal parts relief, grief, and awe. Relief because Lila was laughing without bargaining with the dark, grief because he had missed so much while conquering markets and burying silence under marble. Awe because tenderness, practiced daily, had the discipline of any craft and the courage to remake a house. He had managed the logistics. Someone else had brought devotion through his gates and asked for nothing in return. When the house quieted, he returned to the console, not as a warden, but as a student. He replayed the storm footage and watched details he had missed. How Grace angled her body so thunder faced her back first. How she counted between lightning and rumble to turn terror into numbers. How she dimmed the hall lamp but left a nightlight glowing like a promise. He felt both gratitude and shame braided together. Gratitude that Lila had found harbor, shame that he had not known the coastline. He opened the binder containing Lila's evaluations and read what he had skimmed months ago. Heightened startle response in storms, mitigation through steady touch, measured breathing, and predictable sound. He had signed, delegated, and moved on. Closing the binder, he acknowledged a truth he had avoided. He solved mergers because mergers asked to be solved. Near midnight, wind teased the eaves. From the corridor, he heard a woman thread the air, Grace awake, letting a melody travel the hall like a lighthouse beam. He didn't need the cameras. The house itself had become an instrument, and someone competent was teaching it to sing. He stood there a long time, counting his own breaths, until the tune faded and quiet settled like a blessing over the doors. Dawn paled the windows. Nicholas poured water instead of whiskey and felt how simple choices tilt entire days. He made 2 decisions that felt like one. Grace Morales would stay, and he would speak to her not as an employer issuing orders, but as a father asking to learn. He did not know the syllabus. He knew only the first assignment: begin where the fear lives and map it until courage knows the way. He looked to the garden one last time. Mist lay low over the hedges like breath. Yesterday's barefoot prints had already vanished, but he did not want the lesson to fade. He wanted it written into the foundation. He wanted his daughter to believe thunder could be counted, corridors could carry lemon and cedar and psalm, and a hand would always meet hers at the edge of the unknown. He wanted, finally, what money could never command: the language of safety spoken fluently at home. The morning sun slanted through the tall windows of the breakfast room, catching the gleam of polished silverware. Nicholas sat at the head of the table, his coffee untouched, his gaze fixed on the doorway. He had not slept much after watching the storm footage. He needed answers, not just about Grace's actions, but about her presence in his daughter's life. When Grace entered with Lila, she greeted him with polite composure, her robe replaced with a crisp blouse and plain skirt. Lila clutched her hand and smiled faintly, humming a tune from the night before. Nicholas's jaw tightened. He gestured toward the chairs. "Sit," he said, his tone firmer than intended. Grace hesitated, then guided Lila into her seat and sat beside her. Nicholas leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Why didn't you tell me? About her fear of storms?" Grace met his gaze without flinching. "Because it wasn't mine to tell. It was hers to show you, when she was ready. Children don't reveal fears on command." Nicholas bristled. He was not used to employees speaking with such candor. Yet her voice was steady, not defensive, only certain. He pressed on. "How did you know what to do? The breathing, the counting, the humming. No training manual covers that." Grace's hands rested calmly on the table. "I had a brother, Daniel. He was blind from birth. Thunder terrified him. I learned how to anchor him, through sound, through rhythm, through touch. You don't fight fear with logic, you meet it with presence. Lila listened quietly, her head tilted. Nicholas's throat tightened at the mention of Grace's brother. Something in her tone carried memory heavy with love and loss. "You had a brother," Nicholas repeated slowly. "And you cared for him like this?" Grace nodded. Her expression softened, though grief lingered in her eyes. "Until he died when I was 19. Heart complications. He taught me everything I know about courage, about living without sight. Since then, I've tried to honor him by helping others the way he helped me understand the world." Nicholas fell silent. He had expected excuses or flustered apologies, but instead, she offered her past like an open book. He looked at his daughter, who was nibbling toast with unusual contentment, her hand relaxed in her lap. Something inside him shifted uneasily. Over the next days, Nicholas began watching Grace more deliberately, not from suspicion, but from a reluctant fascination. He discovered that her methods carried both creativity and patience. In the mornings, she cooked meals from scratch, letting Lila measure flour by touch, spices to learn their differences. Nicholas once found them in the kitchen, laughing, as Lila described cinnamon as warm. Afternoons often belonged to books. Grace had ordered a box of Braille storybooks and guided Lila's fingers across the raised dots, reading aloud alongside her until the girl matched rhythm with her own hands. Nicholas watched from the doorway once, his chest tightening at the way Grace celebrated every sentence as though it were a triumph. But the most startling lesson came when Nicholas discovered them in the art room. The long table was covered with bowls of textured materials: sand, rice, coffee grounds, and spices. Grace encouraged Lila to paint, not with colors, but with touch and scent. "Paprika is fire," Grace explained, letting the girls scatter powder across paper. "And rice is rain." Lila pressed her palms into the grains, giggling. Nicholas stepped closer, almost incredulous. He had spent fortunes on imported art supplies and custom tutors, yet this woman had created a masterpiece of sensory imagination with nothing more than kitchen staples. That evening, he returned to his study, but his mind refused to settle. Reports blurred into meaningless numbers. He thought of Grace's hands guiding Lila's across Braille pages, steady and patient. He thought of the girl's laughter echoing through halls that had been silent too long. His curiosity soon grew into something deeper. He wanted to understand who Grace was beyond the uniform. Late one night, after ensuring Lila was asleep, he asked his assistant for a file. It was thin, filled with sparse details, a modest education cut short, a series of low-paying jobs, volunteer work at... Nicholas stared at the paper, unsettled. This woman had no wealth, no power, no influence, yet she had given his daughter more than all his resources combined. The next morning, he found her in the garden with Lila. Grace had closed her own eyes, holding Lila's hand as they walked the hedge maze blindfolded together. "Trust the sound of the fountain," she encouraged. "Follow it." Nicholas froze, a pang of awe and guilt striking him simultaneously. She wasn't just teaching his daughter how to live without sight, she was living it alongside her. Nicholas stood at the edge of the maze for several minutes, listening. He heard Grace counting softly, marking steps for Lila. He heard laughter spill into the air when the girl took a wrong turn and bumped the hedge. "Explorers don't cry over dead ends," Grace teased. "They celebrate finding them." Lila clapped her hands and shouted, "Then I'm the best explorer." The sound tugged at Nicholas's chest in a way he could not easily shake off. That night, unable to quiet his thoughts, he poured a glass of water and sat by the wide office window overlooking the estate. Memories surfaced, his late wife's gentle hand on Lila's hair, the way her voice soothed fears Nicholas had grown like ivy around them, and he had buried himself in work, convinced it was protection. Now a stranger's presence was cracking that silence apart. Grace's own past came into sharper focus through fragments she offered in conversation. She mentioned working at a diner in the evenings while tutoring children with disabilities during the day. She spoke of saving every cent to cover her mother's medical bills after Daniel died, never once indulging herself. She had lived in small apartments, sometimes in shared rooms, yet she always found time to volunteer at schools, teaching blind children to read music or navigate hallways with dignity. So Nicholas found himself watching her during dinner. She didn't eat until Lila had everything she needed. She guided the girl's hands to the plate, describing each portion. She sat straight, spoke gently, but never with pity. Pity was absent from every word, every gesture. It was replaced with quiet respect. Later, in the library, Nicholas lingered in the doorway while Grace read aloud. Lila's fingers traced Braille lines, while Grace's voice wrapped around the words like music. Nicholas didn't recognize the story, but the rhythm of their shared reading struck him more than the content. It was the rhythm of belonging. His own childhood had been different. Nannies and tutors parading through rooms, none leaving a lasting impression. His father had spoken of responsibility, never of love. His mother had filled charity events with laughter but left her children in the care of strangers. Nicholas had grown up wealthy, educated, and emotionally hollow. Watching Grace and Lila together, he realized he was witnessing something he had never known himself. Love that cost nothing and gave everything. A week later, a sudden rain shower caught them in the garden. Nicholas hurried down with an umbrella, only to stop when he saw Grace tilt her face to the sky, encouraging Lila to do the same. "Rain doesn't hurt," she said. "It sings." Lila lifted her palms, laughing as drops splashed into her hands. Nicholas, frozen beneath the veranda, realized he had never taught his daughter to laugh at rain. He had only taught her to avoid mess. That night, he confronted Grace again, though softer this time. "Why do you do it?" he asked in the study, while Lila slept. "You go beyond what's expected. You give pieces of yourself that no contract requires." Grace looked at him calmly, her expression illuminated by lamplight. "Because Daniel deserved better than the world gave him. Because children like Lila deserve to know they aren't burdens, they're adventurers. And because I promised myself I would never walk away when someone needed the kind of help I once wished for." Nicholas's throat closed. He wanted to argue, to remind her of wages and duties, but the truth stripped him bare. He had built empires on strategy, yet here was a woman who built meaning from loss. He envied her strength even as it unsettled him. In the weeks that followed, he stopped pretending indifference. He watched more openly as Grace encouraged Lila to measure rice by handfuls, to identify herbs by scent, to draw pictures with textured paints that told stories through touch. The mansion, once sterile, began to smell of cinnamon and thyme, of wet paint and laughter. Nicholas realized he was no longer simply observing. He was learning. One evening, he entered the kitchen to find Lila smearing peanut butter in wide strokes across bread. "I'm painting with taste," she announced. Grace laughed and handed her sliced bananas as stars. Nicholas, awkward, picked up a knife and asked what he could add. Grace looked at him, her eyes steady, and said, "Make the sky." For the first time in years, Nicholas made sandwiches not as meals but as art. Later, when the house was quiet, he admitted to himself that Grace Morales had unsettled the foundation of everything he believed. She wasn't a tutor, or an employee, or a passing caretaker. She was someone who had walked through grief, carried scars, and still found a way to transform pain into guidance. He wondered what his daughter would become if she continued to be shaped by hands like hers. He wondered what he himself might become if he allowed those same hands to teach him too. And for the first time in years, Nicholas Vale felt not control, not strategy, but hope. The marble halls of the Vale mansion had not known laughter for so long that when it returned, it startled Nicholas from his solitude. He was reviewing reports in his office when a sound floated down the corridor, high-pitched, delighted giggles mingled with exaggerated voices. He set his pen down, frowning, listening closer. It came from the east wing, near the smaller dining room. Curiosity tugged at him until he rose and followed the sound. As he approached, the scent of herbs and toasted bread drifted into the hallway, accompanied by more laughter. He paused at the doorway and found the scene almost unreal. On the wide oak table lay a makeshift kitchen. Pots, pans, and bowls of ingredients cluttered every surface. Lila stood on a small stool, a towel tied around her shoulders like a chef's cape. In one hand, she brandished a wooden spoon like a scepter, her eyes alight with mischief. Beside her, Grace knelt with mock seriousness, holding a notepad as if she were the sous chef taking orders. "Chef Lila, what is tonight's masterpiece?" Grace asked in a grand tone. Rainbow pasta with magic sauce, Lila declared, twirling the spoon. Nicholas leaned against the doorframe, half-groaned, his lips twitching against his will. What, pray tell, makes the sauce magic? Grace continued, feigning awe. Hyperca, Lila said solemnly, and love. Grace grinned, jotting something down with exaggerated importance. Excellent. I shall prepare the station. Nicholas coughed softly, stepping into the room. Both pairs of eyes turned toward him, Lila's, blind, but sensing his presence instantly. Grace's, surprised but welcoming. Papa, Lila beamed. You're just in time. You can be the assistant's assistant, H said hurriedly. He had never been invited into these play worlds before. His instinct was to decline, to retreat to his safe territory of work and distance. But Lila's face, so bright, melted his hesitation. Do I do? He asked, awkward, his voice rough. Grace handed him a bowl of tomatoes. Chop, sir. The assistant's assistant must always chop. He frowned. I don't cook. Then tonight you learn, Grace said lightly, turning back to the stove with Lila. Nicholas rolled up his sleeves, fumbling with the knife. His cuts were clumsy, uneven, but when Lila heard the sound of the blade against the board, she clapped her hands. Papa's helping. That joy, so pure, tightened something in his chest. He glanced at Grace, who gave him a small, encouraging smile before returning to her pretend script. For the next hour, the three of them moved around the table like a family in rehearsal for a life they had never lived together. Grace directed, Lila commanded, Nicholas stumbled, but tried. When they finally sat to eat the oddly spiced pasta, Lila declared it the best magic sauce ever, and Nicholas couldn't disagree. Later that night, after the house quieted, Nicholas returned to his study. He meant to finish the reports he had abandoned, but exhaustion overtook him. He dozed in the leather chair, only to be woken by the soft sound of paper sliding across the desk. He opened his eyes to see Grace standing there, a folded drawing in her hands. Lila wanted you to have this, she whispered. He unfolded the paper. Crayon lines filled the page, a stick figure family drawn with uneven shapes. In the center was Lila, smiling wide. Beside her, a tall figure with dark hair, Grace. On the other side, another figure with long hair, Grace. Above them, written in shaky letters, were the words, My New Family. Nicholas's throat closed. He stared at the drawing, unable to speak. Grace, sensing his struggle, stepped back. She sees us as her world, she murmured. Don't underestimate what that means to her. Then she left him alone with the picture, his heart in turmoil. The next days should have been golden, filled with the warmth of newfound connection. But shadows crept in where light had barely begun. It started with whispers in the city's social columns. Anonymous sources hinted at Nicholas's inappropriate closeness with the nanny. They called Grace a social climber, a woman who had cleverly used sympathy to place herself near a fortune. The gossip spread quickly, fueled by Nicholas's cousin Victor Vale, who had long coveted control of the family trust. Victor had no shame in feeding the fire. He provided tabloids with screenshots of Grace's old social media, photos of her working double shifts at a diner, her appeals for medical donations during her brother's illness, her small apartment with peeling paint. Proof, he called it, that she had always been desperate for wealth. The papers ate it up. Headlines screamed, Nanny or opportunist. Valerius as caretaker hides secret struggles. Within days, paparazzi began circling the estate gates. Reporters shouted questions. Grace, did you plan this from the start? Are you after Nicholas Vale's fortune? Grace kept her head down, shielding Lila when she accompanied her outside. Nicholas watched from the balcony, fury rising, but he remained silent publicly, waiting for the storm to die down. Silence had always been his weapon, but for Grace, the silence was. One evening, as she walked down the corridor, she overheard Victor speaking with a guest near the study. She's clever, I'll give her that, he sneered. Attach herself to a blind child, win sympathy, then climb her way into Nicholas's bed. It's classic. Grace froze, her hands trembling. The cruelty of the words struck like knives, Not because she believed them, but because they echoed the whispers of every insecurity she carried. She turned, ready to pack her things, her breath and as she passed the playroom, she heard a small voice. "Don't go," Lila whispered from the doorway, clutching her rabbit. "You'll leave like the others, won't you?" Grace knelt, tears pricking her eyes. "Sweetheart, I don't want to. But your family?" "You are my family," Lila said fiercely, wrapping her arms around Grace's neck. "Promise you won't leave me, please." Grace closed her eyes, the child's desperation anchoring her to the floor. She couldn't answer, she couldn't promise. But in that moment, she knew the choice would tear her apart either way. Grace carried Lila back into the playroom, her arms tight around the little girl's fragile body. She set her gently on the couch, brushing damp curls from her forehead. "Rest, darling," she whispered, though her own chest was knotted. Lila clung to her hand, unwilling to let go, until sleep eventually claimed her. When Grace finally stood, she walked the hallway alone, her heart pounding. The words she had overheard from Victor repeated like poison. Climb her way into Nicholas's bed, classic. She pressed a hand to her mouth, nausea curling through her. She had worked so hard to live with integrity, to serve without expectation, to carry her brother's legacy of dignity, and now the world saw her as nothing but a... In her room, she began pulling clothes into a bag. Each folded shirt was like an act of surrender. She told herself it was better this way, to leave before she brought more scandal to Nicholas, or more cruelty to Lila. Her trembling fingers caught on the frayed edge of her brother's old scarf, the last thing of his she had kept. She pressed it to her face, whispering, "I tried, Daniel, I really tried." The door creaked, and Nicholas's voice broke the silence. "What are you doing?" Grace spun, her eyes blazing with unshed tears. "What does it look like?" "I'm leaving." His gaze dropped to the half-packed bag, then rose back to hers. His face was unreadable, but his jaw was taut. "Because of the papers? Because of Victor's lies?" "Because I can't breathe here," she snapped, her voice trembling. "Every hallway whispers, every shadow accuses." "I didn't come to your house to be dissected, Mr. Vale. I came to care for a child." Nicholas stepped further in, lowering his voice. "And you've done more than that. You've given her life again. You've given me." He stopped, biting the words back. Grace shook her head, her throat tight. "Then why don't you say anything? Why don't you defend me? You have the power to silence them, but you choose silence instead. Do you know how it feels to be burned alive by words you don't deserve, and the one man who could stop it says nothing?" Nicholas' composure faltered, his eyes stormy. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For a man who negotiated billion-dollar deals, words had never felt so inadequate. "I thought," he exhaled sharply, "I thought staying quiet would make the pass, that answering would give them more fuel." Grace laughed bitterly, wiping at her face. "That's not protection, that's abandonment." The air between them trembled. Grace's voice broke as she whispered, "Do you have any idea how many times I've been called desperate? How many nights I worked 3 jobs? Not because I was climbing into anyone's bed, but because I refused to give up after losing my brother. And now I'm mocked for caring for your daughter, as if love were a transaction." Nicholas's chest ached at her words. He had never considered how silence could wound more deeply than accusations themselves. He stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "Grace, look at me. I don't believe them. I never did." She shook her head. "But you let them speak." Her eyes, shimmering with hurt, met his, and for a moment, Nicholas felt completely unmoored. She had held his daughter during storms. She had filled their home with laughter, and yet he had left her to fight shadows alone. From the corridor, a small voice interrupted. "Grace?" Both turned to find Lila standing barefoot in her nightgown, her rabbit dangling from one hand. She tilted her face toward the sound of their breathing. "You're not leaving, are you?" Grace froze. Lila's voice was so fragile, so full of dread, that it pierced deeper than Victor's cruelty. Grace knelt, gathering the child into her arms. "Sweetheart?" "Don't go," Lila whispered fiercely, gripping her. "Everyone leaves. Mama left, the other nannies left. Don't you leave too." Tears slid down Grace's cheeks as she rocked the child. "I don't want to. I never wanted to, but sometimes grown-ups really. Leila cried, clinging harder. You're my family. You make the house warm. Papa doesn't laugh without you. Please stay. Nicholas stood frozen, his daughter's words slamming into him. Papa doesn't laugh without you. He had thought himself composed, untouchable, armored by wealth. Yet here, from the lips of his blind daughter, came the undeniable truth. Grace had brought life where he had only offered structure. Grace kissed Lila's hair, her voice trembling. I'll stay tonight, I promise. Relief softened the child's body, and Nicholas carried her gently back to bed, Grace following close. They tucked her in together, Grace smoothing the blanket, Nicholas holding her hand until sleep claimed her. When they stepped back into the hallway, silence stretched between them, heavy but changed. Grace whispered, I'll finish the week, but I can't stay forever. Nicholas's jaw tightened, but he only nodded. For the first time, he realized silence would not save him. If he wanted to keep Grace in Lila's life and his own, he would have to fight, not retreat. That night, long after the house slept, Nicholas sat in his study, staring at the drawing Lila had made. 3 figures, hand in hand, the words, "My new family," written above. His hand trembled as he traced Grace's figure in the picture. He knew then that the whispers in the hallways weren't just rumors. They were crossroads. And if he didn't act soon, shadows would take from him the one thing money could never buy, back. The mansion glowed with chandeliers, the air thick with the murmur of voices and the clinking of glasses. The Vale estate had opened its doors for a charity gala, a long-standing tradition that Nicholas continued out of duty more than desire. Diplomats, financiers, and socialites filled the ballroom, their jewels glittering like constellations. Music swelled from the orchestra, masking Nicholas's gnawing impatience. He hated these nights. Every smile was rehearsed, every sham-cake calculated. He stood at the edge of the crowd, offering polite nods, his mind half elsewhere. Grace had stayed behind to watch Lila, who had been playing in the guest house earlier. He had checked in before the gala began, reassured by Lila's excitement at building a fort out of pillows with Grace's help. Now, as laughter echoed around him, Nicholas felt a tug of unease he couldn't explain. It settled in his chest, stubborn and heavy. The speeches began, and Nicholas forced himself forward, joining a group near the stage. His cousin Victor smirked at him across the crowd, clearly relishing the swirl of rumors still shadowing the household. Nicholas clenched his jaw, refusing to grant him satisfaction. Then, through the music and chatter, came a distant sound. At first it was muffled, like a crack in the rhythm, then clearer, the shrill alarm of fire. Conversations faltered. Guests turned toward the windows as orange light flickered against the night. Gasps rippled through the room. "The guest house," someone shouted. Nicholas's blood ran cold. Lila. He shoved through the crowd, ignoring startled protests. The moment he burst onto the terrace, the sight nearly buckled his knees. Flames licked the side of the guest house, smoke billowing into the night sky. Panic surged through the guests, spilling outside, their gowns and tuxos clashing with the chaos. "Call the fire department," Nicholas barked, sprinting across the lawn. His lungs burned with every step, but all he could think of was his daughter inside. Before he reached the door, a figure darted past him, smaller, faster. "Grace." "Grace?" he roared, his voice hoarse, but she was already gone, swallowed by the smoke as she plunged into the burning building. Time fractured. Nicholas stood paralyzed for a split second, torn between fury and terror. Then he forced himself forward, but the heat slammed him back, searing his skin. He coughed violently, his eyes streaming, unable to push further inside. "Lila!" he shouted, desperately, his voice breaking. And minutes stretched like hours. He strained to see through the smoke, his heart hammering, until at last a shadow emerged. Grace staggered through the doorway, her arms wrapped tightly around Lila's small frame. The child coughed but clung to Grace's neck, her face buried in the nanny's shoulder. Relief struck Nicholas so hard his knees nearly buckled. He surged forward, pulling them both into his arms, his voice shaking. "Lila." "Grace?" Grace thrust Lila toward him, her own body heaving with smoke. "She's safe," she rasped, refusing to let go until Nicholas had the girl secured against his chest. Then, without hesitation, she turned back toward the guest house. "What are you doing?" Nicholas demanded, gripping her arm. "We're still others," she gasped. "One of the staff went in earlier to fetch supplies." Nicholas cursed, but before he could stop her, Grace wrenched free and darted back inside. He pressed Lila close, shielding her face from the smoke, his heart tearing in two as he watched the woman disappear again into the inferno. Moments later, shouts erupted as fire trucks roared up the drive. Nicholas backed away, cradling Lila, as firefighters surged forward with hoses and axes. And then, there she was again. Grace stumbled out, dragging the young footman by the arm, coughing violently but upright. Paramedics rushed to them, pressing oxygen masks over their faces. Nicholas's entire body ached with conflicting emotions: fear, gratitude, fury, awe. He crouched beside Grace as she waved off the paramedics' insistence. "Alina," she rasped, pointing to Lila. "Help her first." Nicholas swallowed hard, his throat raw from more than smoke. He wanted to shout at her for recklessness, to demand why she would risk her life so willingly. But when he looked at her, ash streaking her face, eyes blazing with determination, the words tangled uselessly in his chest. She had chosen without hesitation. She had given everything for his daughter. The fire was subdued quickly after, the guest house smoldering in ruin. Guests huddled in frightened clusters, whispering of heroism and scandal in the same breath. Nicholas ignored them all. He carried Lila inside, Grace walking unsteadily beside them. Once Lila was settled with a doctor, Nicholas turned to Grace. "You..." His voice cracked. He forced himself to steady it. "You saved her life." Grace shook her head, her expression distant. "She's the reason I was here at all. It wasn't bravery, Mr. Vale. It was love." Her words pierced deeper than he expected. He reached for her, but she stepped back. "I don't need thanks. Just make sure she feels safe." Then she walked away, her shoulders trembling, leaving Nicholas rooted in the hallway with the weight of everything he hadn't said. The aftermath of the fire left the estate cloaked in an uneasy quiet. The guest house still smoldered in the distance, its blackened frame visible from the upper balconies. Firefighters had confirmed no lives were lost, but the sight of the ruin lingered like a scar against the manicured grounds. Guests had left in carriages and sedans, whispering their shock into the night. Only staff remained, moving in hushed urgency. Nicholas stayed by Lila's bedside. She had fallen asleep after a thorough check from the physician, her breath still uneven but steady. Every so often she stirred, murmuring Grace's name. Nicholas held her hand, watching the small fingers twitch until calm returned. It was only then that he realized his own hands were trembling. He had nearly lost her, if not for Grace. When the doctor finally left, Nicholas wandered the corridor, searching. He found Grace in the laundry room, sitting alone on a wooden bench, her dress stained with ash, her hair loose and wild from the chaos. She was rubbing her hands with a damp cloth, though the soot refused to leave. Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time since she entered his house, she looked fragile. Nicholas stepped inside quietly. "Grace?" She glanced up, startled, then quickly looked away. "Is Lila all right?" "Sleeping," he said. "Thanks to you." Grace exhaled, her posture relaxing slightly. "That's all that matters." He moved closer, unsure how to begin. Words felt clumsy on his tongue, and he had never been a man to stumble in speech. But now, he felt every word pressing against him like a stone wall. Finally, he managed, "You ran into a burning building. Twice." Grace met his gaze, her eyes tired but steady. She was inside. There was no question. His chest tightened. He lowered himself onto the bench across from her, searching for the right words. "I've built an empire by calculating risks, by protecting assets. But tonight," his voice faltered, "tonight, I realized I've never thanked anyone for protecting what mattered most." Grace's lips curved into a faint, sad smile. "You don't need to thank me." "He do," he insisted, his voice rougher than intended. "Not just for tonight, for everything. For seeing her, for giving her laughter again. For..." He stopped, overwhelmed by the sheer depth of gratitude he could not voice. Grace looked down at her hands, rubbing at the soot again. Mr. Vale, I didn't do this for gratitude. I did it because she deserves someone who won't leave her in the dark. If that person is me, then so be it. If it's someone else one day, then I'll pray they love her as fiercely as she deserves. Her humility stung more than any reproach. Nicholas wanted to tell her she was irreplaceable, that no one else could have done what she did. But his pride, his silence, tangled around him like chains. He reached for her hand, only to stop when she pulled back gently. You should rest, she murmured, standing. Your daughter needs you strong. That's the only thanks I want, for you to be present for her. Nicholas rose as well, but before he could speak again, Grace slipped past him, leaving the faint scent of smoke and lavender in her wake. He remained in the laundry room long after she was gone, staring at the damp cloth she had left behind. It struck him then that he had built walls of marble and glass to shield his life, but none of them had kept danger away, and none of them had taught his daughter how to face fear. Only Grace had done that. When Nicholas finally returned to his study, he found the crayon drawing still on his desk, the one Lila had made, showing herself, her father, and Grace holding hands. He traced the figures again, his throat tightening. For the first time, he admitted the truth to himself. Grace was not simply the nanny, she was the anchor in the storm, the fire that had lit his daughter's world. And the silence he had used as armor was no longer enough. Still, when dawn came, and Grace moved quietly through the house as though nothing had changed, Nicholas found himself watching from the shadows. He whispered a simple thank you when their eyes met, but she only nodded, her expression unreadable, before turning away. And that silence, hers this time, cut deeper than any fire could burn. The fire had barely faded from headlines when Nicholas's lawyer arrived at the estate. A lean man with silver hair and a voice polished by years in courtrooms, he spoke bluntly across the desk. "The woman is a liability, Nicholas," he said, tapping the latest article with a manicured finger. The tabloid cover screamed, "Nanny or savior? Grace Morales? Hero or gold digger?" Nicholas' jaw tightened as he scanned the page. Photos of Grace running from the fire with Lila in her arms had gone viral. While many praised her bravery, whispers continued to gnaw at the family's reputation. The lawyer leaned forward. "You cannot afford sentiment. Every move you make is scrutinized. Keeping her here will only invite more scandal. Let her go, quietly, with severance. End this before it consumes your legacy." Nicholas said nothing. His silence stretched until the lawyer sighed, gathering his papers. "Think carefully, Nicholas. You built an empire on decisive action. Don't let hesitation unravel it." After he left, Nicholas sat in his study, staring at the flames dancing in the fireplace. His empire had been forged in boardrooms, his reputation on contracts and power. Yet when he closed his eyes, he didn't see balance sheets. He saw Grace carrying his daughter through smoke. He heard Lila's giggle as she smeared paprika on paper. He felt the silence. He couldn't give the order. Not yet. Days passed. Grace continued her duties with calm professionalism, but Nicholas noticed the difference. Her laughter was softer, her eyes more guarded. She no longer lingered in the hallways humming lullabies or joined Lila's pretend games with the same abandon. Something had shifted, and Nicholas realized with dread that she was slipping away. Then came the morning. He found an envelope on his desk. His name was written in Grace's neat, steady handwriting. Inside was a letter of resignation. "Mr. Vale," it began, "I cannot allow my presence to bring more turmoil to your household. Lila deserves peace, not headlines. I will finish the week to ensure a smooth transition. Thank you for allowing me to know her, Lila." Nicholas' chest constricted as he read the words. He wanted to tear the letter apart, to storm down the corridor and demand she stay. But instead, he folded it carefully, setting it back on the desk. He told himself this was for the best, that the storm would pass if he let her go. The next days blurred. Grace moved through the house with quiet efficiency, her touch still tender with Lila, but her steps measured with distance. Lila noticed, of course, children always did. She asked questions Nicholas couldn't answer. "Why is Grace Grace Quinn? Did I do something wrong?" He had no reply. On the morning of her departure, Lila clung to Grace like a lifeline. Tears streamed down her cheeks, her small voice breaking. "Don't go. Please don't go. I'll be good. I'll be better. Just don't leave." Grace knelt, holding her close, whispering assurances through her own tears. "Sweetheart, this isn't your fault. You've been perfect. Remember what I taught you? You're an explorer, and explorers are never truly alone. My love will always be with you." Nicholas stood by the doorway, frozen, his hands clenched into fists. He wanted to speak, to beg her to stay, but no words came. His silence hung heavy in the air, and Grace kissed Lila's forehead one last time before rising with her suitcase. As she walked past him, Nicholas whispered hoarsely, "Thank you." Grace paused, her back to him. For a moment, he thought she might turn, might reconsider, but she only nodded, her voice soft. "Take care of her." Then she was gone. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the mansion like a final verdict. The mansion had never felt emptier. Nicholas moved through its grand halls and heard only silence. No laughter echoing down the corridor, no lull hum of lullabies drifting from the kitchen, teaching Lila the difference between cinnamon and nutmeg. The air itself felt heavier, as though warmth had been siphoned from the walls. Lila retreated into herself. She ate little, spoke less, and often sat by the window, clutching her rabbit. She asked for Grace every night, her voice breaking when Nicholas could not answer. He tried reading to her, stumbling over the Braille books Grace had introduced, but his voice lacked the melody she loved. He tried cooking with her, but the kitchen became a place of frustration rather than joy. His efforts only magnified what was missing. For the first time in his adult life, Nicholas felt powerless. Not the powerless of losing a deal or a fortune. He could recover from those. This was different. This was the powerless of watching his child fade, of knowing he had allowed silence to steal the one person who had brought her light. A week later, Nicholas visited Lila's school unannounced. The classroom was lively, filled with children laughing as they explored tactile maps and sound puzzles. But Lila sat apart, tracing the edge of her desk with her fingers, her expression vacant. "Tell her," her teacher coaxed gently. "Would you like to join the group?" She shook her head, whispering, "Not without Grace." The teacher offered Nicholas a sympathetic glance. He approached, kneeling beside his daughter. "Sweetheart," he murmured, "you can still play." She turned her sightless eyes toward him, her voice trembling. "It's not the same, Papa. She made me brave. Without her, I just don't want it." Her words pierced him deeper than any insult Victor or the tabloids had ever thrown his way. He reached for her hand, but she pulled it back, folding into herself again. On the drive home, Nicholas stared out at the city passing in blur. His mind replayed every moment, the night of the thunderstorm, the laughter in the hallway, the fire, the drawing of their new family. He had told himself Grace was hired help, a temporary presence, but the truth was undeniable now. She was not a disruption to his home. She was the pulse that had brought it back to life. That night, Nicholas stood once more in his study. The envelope with Grace's resignation still sat on his desk, as though mocking him. He unfolded the letter and read it again, slower this time. Lila deserves peace, not headlines. She is light. He realized then that Grace had never been afraid of hardship, of rumors, or even of fire. What she feared was becoming a burden. And in his silence, he had let her believe she was one. Nicholas pressed his hand over the crayon drawing pinned to the wall. Lila, himself, and Grace holding hands. His chest ached with a truth too sharp to ignore. Wealth could buy him estates, influence, and protection, but it could not buy the warmth that Grace had given freely. For the first time in his life, Nicholas Vale understood what true emptiness felt like. Not the absence of power, but the absence of love. Not the loss of wealth, but the loss of a woman who had turned a hollow mansion into a home. The week after Grace's departure unfolded in shades of gray. Lila had grown quieter, her teachers reporting that she barely engaged with activities she once embraced. Nicholas drove her to school one morning, watching her small figure slump in the seat, and felt the ache of helplessness gnaw deeper. That afternoon, his phone buzzed relentlessly. Notifications poured in, message after message, until his assistant burst into the office. "Sir, You need to see this." He handed Nicholas a tablet. On the screen played a short video, grainy but clear enough. The setting was Lila's school gymnasium. An obstacle course had been set up with cones, ropes, and balance beams. Children darted about, their laughter echoing, and there, in the center, was Grace. She stood beside Lila, her voice calm, guiding her step by step. 2 paces forward, now to the left. "Yes, you've got it. Listen to my clap." "That's where you aim." Lila followed, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. The camera zoomed in as Grace crouched low, clapping rhythmically, encouraging her. When Lila crossed the finish line, the room erupted in cheers. Lila beamed, her smile wide and unguarded, and Grace caught her in a hug, whispering something the microphone barely caught. "See? You're unstoppable." Nicholas's throat constricted. He watched the clip again, then again, each time more shaken. The comments scrolling beneath were endless. "This woman is an angel. Every child deserves a Grace in their life. Grace for Lila, make this trend." And it did. Within hours, the hashtag exploded. News outlets picked it up, calling Grace a real-life heroine. Journalists who once printed gossip now backtracked, praising her devotion. The same photos Victor had leaked, of Grace working in diners, fundraising for her brother's hospital bills, were reframed as evidence of her resilience, not shame. Nicholas sat frozen in his office, replaying the moment when Lila's smile lit the screen. His silence had allowed others to define Grace, but the truth had found its way into the light anyway, and the world saw what he had been too afraid to defend. That evening, he stood before the press for the first time in months. Cameras flashed as reporters called his name. He didn't bring a prepared statement. He didn't consult his lawyers. He simply stepped up to the podium, the viral clip still burning in his mind. "So much has been said about Grace Morale," he began, his voice steady, "but I want the world to know who she really is. She is the woman who held my daughter during storms, who taught her to walk with confidence, who risked her life in a fire to bring her home. She is not a liability. She is the reason my daughter smiles." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Nicholas inhaled deeply. "As for the lies spread against her, they came from within my own family. My cousin, Victor Vale, fed tabloids with twisted truths to protect his claim to the trust. Today I end that silence. His campaign was cruel, and it ends now." The reporters erupted in questions, flashes blinding him, but Nicholas stepped away, his heart pounding. For once, he hadn't calculated outcomes or weighed risks. He had simply spoken the truth. Later that night, he sat alone in his study, the crayon drawing still pinned above his desk. He traced the words "my new family" with trembling fingers. The fire, the scandal, the silence, all of it had brought him here, and now he knew the truth with painful clarity. Grace wasn't someone who disrupted his life. She was the one who gave it meaning. The next morning, Nicholas dismissed his driver and took the wheel himself. He followed an address his assistant had given him, a modest neighborhood on the city's edge. The streets were narrow, lined with aging brick apartments and corner shops. He parked by a low building with a faded sign, "Community Food Bank." Inside, the air smelled of spices and warm bread. Volunteers bustled about, packing boxes of canned goods and vegetables. And there she was, Grace. Her hair was pulled back, her sleeves rolled, her hands moving quickly as she sorted supplies. She laughed softly with an elderly woman beside her, her eyes bright despite the exhaustion Nicholas knew must weigh on her. For a moment, he stood frozen in the doorway, watching her. She didn't see him, didn't expect him. She was simply herself, giving, steady, luminous. Finally, she looked up, startled, and their eyes met. "Nicholas," she breathed, his name a mixture of shock and disbelief. "What are you doing here?" He stepped closer, the noise of the room fading around him. For once, he didn't speak of wealth or reputation. His voice was quiet, raw. "Lila's world needs you," he said, "more than mine ever did." Grace's lips parted, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. Around them, the volunteers continued their work, oblivious to the weight of the moment. For Nicholas, it felt like a confession, not just of need, but of truth. And, for the first time since she left, he felt a sliver of hope pierce through the emptiness. The night was crisp, the kind that carried the faint scent of autumn on the wind. The Vale estate had long since grown quiet, its grandeur cloaked in moonlight. Nicholas walked the familiar paths with Lila's rabbit clutched in his hand, the little toy she had dropped after school. His feet carried him not to the mansion, but to the garden maze, where memories lingered like ghosts. He found Grace there. She sat on the weathered bench beneath the oak tree, her head tilted back, gazing at the stars. The silver glow lit her face, softening the exhaustion that still clung to her features. For a long moment, Nicholas simply watched, his breath caught by the stillness of the scene. When she heard his footsteps, she shifted, startled. "Nicholas," she said quietly, "I didn't think you'd come." He held up the rabbit. "Lila left this in the car. I thought she'd want it nearby." Grace's lips curved faintly, but her eyes flickered with hesitation. She always holds it tighter when she feels uncertain. Nicholas sat on the far end of the bench, leaving space between them. The silence stretched, broken only by the rustle of leaves. Finally, he said, this was her mother's favorite spot. She used to sit here and tell Lila stories about the constellations before she got sick. His voice caught on the memory, but he pressed on. "I haven't sat here since she passed." Grace turned her gaze back to the stars. "It feels like a place meant for truths." He exhaled, leaning forward. "Then maybe it's time I stop hiding mine." He paused, searching for words. "I was raised to believe vulnerability was weakness. My father measured worth in deals closed, not hearts opened. When I lost my wife, I convinced myself I could protect Lila by building walls. But everyone out, but all I did was leave her alone inside them." Grace's eyes glistened, but she didn't interrupt. He looked at her then, really looked, the moonlight reflecting in his dark eyes. "You changed that. You walked into a house of silence and gave it sound again. You gave her laughter. You gave me something I thought I'd buried for good." Grace swallowed hard, her hands twisting in her lap. "Nicholas, I didn't come here to be anything more than a caretaker. I never wanted to replace anyone or disrupt your world." "You didn't," he said firmly. "You reminded me that worlds don't need to be controlled, they need to be shared." The words lingered between them, heavy with meaning. Grace's heart raced, torn between belief and doubt. She wanted to trust him, to believe that this man who once hid behind silence had truly changed. But scars from her past whispered caution. "You don't understand," she murmured, her voice unsteady. "I've lived most of my life being overlooked, mocked for not having enough, pitied for my brother, then dismissed when I struggled after he died. I built myself on the promise that I would never beg for belonging. And here, with you," she shook her head, "it feels too much like a dream." Nicholas's expression softened. "Then let me be the one who proves it isn't." A breeze swept through, carrying the faint scent of roses. Lila's laughter from weeks ago seemed to echo in Nicholas's mind, mingling with the crackle of fire and the sight of Grace carrying her through smoke. He reached across the distance, his hand hovering near hers. "Grace, I can't change the mistakes I made, but I can promise you this: I won't let silence be my answer again."